Hello, hello. How's everyone doing today? Okay, so we're going to be kicking off a new class today, which is going to be going over effective testing in RSpec 3. Now, our goal is going to be looking through a lot of how testing is done in Ruby. I mean, there's RSpec, there's mini tests, there's asserts, there's a bunch of other things, but we're going to be focusing on RSpec, what makes it different, and what some of the thinking is behind that. So for this first section here, we're going to be covering chapters 1, 2, and 3, which comprise part 1, which is primarily setup. So that all said, shall we get started into things? And this time I've learned better. I immediately switch over to the code screen. Okay, so let's start over in chapter 1. I have the book over here to the side, but for obvious reasons, I'm not going to display the book. Okay. So reading through some of the first chapter, it describes RSpec as a productive Ruby test framework. As far as style, API library settings supported for great software. We won't get too much into this, but they're saying that a good test provides design guidance of helping you distill all those ideas in your head into maintainable code, a safety net for finding errors in your code, and documentation, which is behaviors of systems to help work the maintainer. For me, a lot of times with RSpec and with testing in general, it's verifying that code works as I expect. And honestly, most of the time I'm spending 60-70% of my time actually coding, writing RSpec. You might think, well, why are you going to do that? Why don't you just write the code? Well, that's because code has one very obvious thing, but it could have multiple failure scenarios. It could have multiple ways it's handled. And I want to make sure that those are tested. And then even more, either for me or for people sometime in the future, if I happen to change any of that stuff, it should break something potentially if I've made any mistakes that I don't really know about, which is very possible. Hello, hello. So for me, RSpec is describing and making sure I actually think through what it is I'm writing, as well as making sure to protect future me from past me, or rather, the other way around. And feel free to ask questions in chat anytime. I try and say hi to people as they come in. Okay, let's see what we got here. So that goes through some of the introduction there. So the book mentions installing RSpec. What I did instead in here is I just have gem RSpec. And honestly, I just copied this directly from another gem file because lazy, I don't memorize that. No one really does. So put that in there, bundle to install it. It's already installed, so we're good there. So we have all of our RSpec stuff right here, as well as some of the dependencies. And then we can check over in gem file lock, which says we're at 3.12 right now. And then we can also do RSpec-version. And just double checking, is this large enough for people? If not, I can make that a little bit larger. Well, at any time on that, if it is too small, feel free to mention it to me. Okay, so let's see what exactly they have there. One of my favorite things. I'm going to try and emulate the structure of the book and all the directories they're doing. If you haven't seen make directory -p, it'll create all of the intermediary folders so you don't have to do anything. So we'll do this. So now we have all the way into there. New file, which is sandwich spec. Okay, and then we will copy over some of the stuff they have in there. misspell that? I totally did. I'm counting on all you to keep me honest over here. Okay. So we can start with that real quick. Let's see here, 01. So those are technically steps. I'm thinking about how I want to lay out all this stuff. I could probably do folder 02 in there if I really wanted to. Is that 02/spec? You know, tell you what, as long as these are the same, we're just going to compile these all into one thing. That sounds good to me. Okay. So we'll go ahead and copy over the code from there. And as a side note, if you're thinking, hey, wait a second, sandwich doesn't exist, that is correct, and there will definitely be something which covers that in a second. Okay, so we got that. Okay, so the book wants us to break down some of what's going on over here. Now, if you've seen past versions of RSpec, you might have seen something like a top level describe something over here, do end. The reason we're using RSpec here instead is so we don't have a top level method. Inside of that block, however, we're in the context of RSpec, which allows us to do things such as this. And as far as how this works, well, in Ruby, this is actually not terribly bad. So let's say that we make describe text block, and then we could say something like puts text block.call So technically, these are all let's see here. Bye, spam. Okay. So technically, these are just blocks which call, and each one of these, like describe, it, and everything else, are just going to be nested blocks which happen to have things inside of them, like hooks, like expect. So describe is essentially a wrapper to group all these specs together. You might also see something like context. Well, in all honesty, describe is pretty much the same thing as context. It doesn't really matter too terribly much. So we have that. The difference between the two, I think the book will get into a little bit later, but we'll briefly go over it right now. Describe is describing something. Context is describing a certain context of what's going on around that. Like I could say a ham sandwich or a vegetarian sandwich or a BLT or anything else. Like if I wanted setup that's specifically going to make something in a different context inside the thing I'm describing, like, well, anyway, we won't get too much into that. But effectively, they do the same thing. It's just semantic meaning. which is most of Ruby. Ruby loves doing that. Okay, so let's see what we got here. So going back with the book, what it's starting with is spec, which is specification rather than tests. And describe over here is creating what we call an example group, or keeping related specs together. For me, describe is a certain behavior. Context is variations on that behavior. Okay. So they do go into some amount of difference between test and specs, and examples of saying a test validates the code's working properly, a spec describes desired behavior, an example shows how particular APIs are used. For me, it seems like those are overlapping enough definitions, but if we want to be strict about them, I suppose we could. So one thing you'll notice in a lot of RSpec tests is there's a certain grammar that always happens, which is going to be arrange, which is get your data together, act on that data, do something with it, and then finally assertion. So arrange would be something like this, which is we need a sandwich. Taste might be something like we want to get the values that we're actually going to test. I mean, we could always just do that right there. With some tests, this makes more sense. With other tests, well, not quite as much. So we have that. And then finally, the assertion, you'll notice that most of the time these are in the end. Sometimes you'll have a couple of stanzas and things. And by stanza, I mean like you might have an expectation up here, and then you might have something up here. And then you could have multiple of these. There's nothing stopping you from doing that, but for the most part, you want to keep one example in a group. And typically it's going to follow that order of setup, action, and eventually assertion or expectation in this case. So the book mentions that this spec serves a couple of purposes: documenting what it should do, what the sandwich should do, and checking what it's supposed to do. For me, a lot of times if I'm reading a new library, I like to go to the specs to see, okay, how should this thing actually be performing? What exactly does library's author or authors expect this to do? And that can be very useful, especially if there's not much documentation besides that to figure out how something is working. Now, they also mention that there is another syntax from a couple of other testing frameworks, which might look something more like this, which is assert equal. Oh, right, they have special space characters. Anyway, that's going to be quoted because there's some type of Unicode character somewhere in that book, which is pesky, and I'm not going to play around with that too much. Okay, anyway, let's see what we got here. So in this case, what we have is assert A is equal to B, and then the failure message. For me, that's unintuitive, and this is why RSpec instead has the expect to, not to, and then what exact comparison you're doing, which could be something like equal, include, contains. There are a lot of different matchers you could do, which provides you with a lot of flexibility to do things. And that's why I tend to prefer RSpec versus this assertion format, because then you have assert equal, assert greater than, assert. It gets to be a little bit cumbersome. Of course, matter of preference, like everything, but, oh, right, delete that real quick. So you're free to like what you want. You're free to do what you want on that. For me, I prefer the RSpec syntax. Okay, so understanding failure. Let's go ahead and run that real quick, and it should fail. Okay. So we're going into a section of understanding failure. The first thing is uninitialized constant sandwich. Well, we're trying to make a class, and where's sandwich? It doesn't exist. So we're going to have to do something with that. The output color is also useful here. You'll notice that it's red. If the test passes, it's going to be green. You'll also notice this one failure down here, as well as failed examples. Now, the nice thing is you see this little :2 right there? That is really useful. Let's say you only want to run one spec instead of this entire group of them. That's really, really handy for, I just want to run that one thing that failed, nothing else. Great, so that works out pretty well for you. And then pending specs, which we will mention a little bit later, are going to be marked in yellow. Short version of how that looks though. Exit. Now it's yellow, it's pending, and you get a star up here. Oh, right, there's an F up here if it fails. So we'll save that. Go back to our failure. Okay. So let's go ahead and make the struct that they're mentioning where. Okay, so now we happen to have a struct, and if you have not seen a struct yet, a struct is not that bad. Think of it as a lightweight class. They're very useful if you just want to put data in a box that you can deal with to put some nice names on it. Like, let's say struct.new xy, okay. And then there you go, you have a struct right there. So those are useful for just quick test data or containers if you don't have a lot of behaviors on them. Now, if you find yourself adding a lot of behaviors, and you can by giving it a block format right here and putting a whole bunch of methods inside of here, if you find yourself doing that, just do the class because it's going to be a lot easier. You'll also notice that there are no default values on toppings right here, which is why we're passing in an array right there. So if we happen to do that, we happen to save that and run this, we'll notice that we now have one passing example with a green dot right here. Okay, so let's take a look into some of the shared setup here. And this is in the sharing setup section that we're at right now. Okay. And this particular style of writing tests and then minimally adding code to make those tests pass is called test-driven development. For me, I flip back and forth. It depends on how well I know what it is I'm developing. Sometimes I'll be more likely to spend a lot of time in IRB or REPL just throwing code against the wall until eventually something sticks, and then I'll paste it back into a file and then I'll test it. So again, it's very much a matter of do what works for you on that. So let's go ahead and write some of this down real quick. So we have the sandwich. Sandwich up topping. Okay, so we have all of those. If we were to run that spec again, that should work. Okay. So what the book is mentioning is this seems a bit repetitive. Like we have both these sandwiches right here. There are a few different ways that we could do this to clean this up. The book goes through a few of them and starts out with using an instance variable. Now, to be clear, I would not suggest using an instance variable on some of these, and we'll get into why later. I'd suggest using another thing, which the book does mention later in this chapter. So let's just start with that. So we'll say sandwich is equal to this. So we can get rid of all those. Put ampersands there. And if you're wondering what I'm doing there, if you see me clearing terminal down here, that's Control L, which is clear backtrace. And if you notice me selecting multiple things at the same time, in VS Code, that's Command D, which I'm pretty sure is me using Sublime mode on things, which is bindings from a different application. So we have that. So if you ever see me do something and you're wondering, how in the world did he just do that? Feel free to ask, and I can stop and explain that for a second. So let's make sure this is working real quick, that we haven't done anything there. Okay, so that is working. So we have those. So as far as this, you'll notice that we have this hook right here. And there's before, there's also after, and there are a few other ones, but we'll focus on before and after. So they also happen to take an option, like say before each, before all, and in configuration, you could do something like before a suite, which is nice if you want to do some setup for everything. Now, I will jump back to before and what I actually tend to do with them in a second, but we'll leave it alone for now. Okay, so we have that. So there was another one, which is adding a helper method. In which we could do this. Sometimes I'll have helper methods or set up like this if there's some complex object that I'm trying to assemble. But as we'll see, I'll explain that in a second as soon as we get to let and what that's doing. So let's run that again real quick, make sure that's working. Okay, if we did do that, let's call it get sandwich. I don't exactly like overlapping things. So we have that. So it's expected to fail in there. Ah, right. So what they're doing right here is trying to cache that. There's going to be some bad behavior in here, but we'll see what it does. I mean, it's going to pass for now, but if we happen to look at it, we'd see that we're overriding the exact same thing. So we have mutable state, which is going to make flaky specs, which is going to be a pain. So I would not do this specifically, and there's a better way to do this, which they're going to mention in a second. Okay, so they have a few mentions of a toaster. We'll leave that alone, which is getting started 08, and we'll skip right into let instead. Okay, so let's take that. Let's put this in here. Save that, and then that should work. Okay, so let here is a little bit more interesting. What that's doing is for each one of these examples, and by example I mean anything inside an it block, it provides a new thing called sandwich that will only be activated whenever it's called. So let's say we have sandwich right here. We're going to have that sandwich. So just for the sake of it, we'll put Ohio sandwich in there, and we'll say the amount of times I forget do on there. And we'll just do that. So we should see 2 instances of that, which means that let's being run twice distinctly. Okay, so we have false, true, and we have oh hi sandwich twice, which means that this block got hit twice, which means we have two sandwich objects. So we can take that away. We can take that away. So typically if I'm doing setup, I'm going to do something like this. And sometimes you'll see people get a little bit carried away with this, and they might do something like taste and all those things. Sometimes that makes sense. Other times you're adding a huge amount of code there, and just do the immediately obvious thing. Again, more of a matter of preference than a matter of anything else. Okay. So that gets us through part 1. Actually, let's save this a couple ones up just in O1 getting started right here. And delete that folder. Okay. Spec, and then let's move this under spec. Okay. So that'll be a little bit easier to organize for later. Okay, anyway. From writing specs to running them. So we're over in chapter 2 right now. Notation, common setup code. And now we're going to look at some of the various matters of running these specs. Okay, so let's go ahead and make new folder. Oh, right. Yeah, I'm still in the Chrome window. Okay, and then let's name that O2. Running specs. Copy spec RB. Just make sure we have that. Okay, nothing concerning there. Okay, copy spec then. Let's go ahead and write that up. Do end, let copy. I have a few shortcuts in here. Not many, I should probably fix them, but okay, so write that all down, and that should be everything. So this brings up an interesting point. One of the things that I tend to do with before blocks. Let I tend to use for setting up data that I need. Before I tend to do for actions that need to happen before each of the specs. Like if I had a bunch of these inside of here and I kept on adding milk, I'm going to pull that up and say that before any of these in this context, I want to add milk. And that's the way I think of before instead of that. There are a few other things you tend to do with before, but I believe we'll get into those a little bit later in the book. Okay, so let's go ahead and make ourselves a coffee class, but in the spirit of seeing things fail, an initialize constant coffee, so we do not have a coffee class. Okay, so initialize. We're not really doing anything with that yet. The book is doing this, so I'm going to move that up here. Give it a reader. That way you can read it, you can't write it, and this initialize is taking care of the default value over there. So a little bit different, but anyway, let's go and say add ingredient. Add that. Do that, and then that should give us at least the first spec passing. And the second failing, I mean, we have the ingredients, but we don't have the new way to compute the price in there. Okay. That said, the dots aren't very useful there until you see that this is the spec which failed. So there is another way to run this, and personally, I kind of prefer this. Format documentation. And if we scroll up, we'll see a copy coffee costs $1, with milk costs $1.25, and we can see the failure right there. There are ways to set this in a configuration if you want this to always happen. There's also -FD instead if you want to do it a little bit shorter, but this is a little bit more useful if you want to see what exactly is going on. And then the nice thing is that each one of these are nested. So you have the context under here, all the examples under here, and you have them green over there. Hello, hello. Okay. So let's see what we have here. Highlighter, cold code ray. Okay, so we'll go ahead and add that to the gem file. Got that, got that. Install that. Okay, so now we have code ray. We can run that again. I mean, we're already getting some of the highlighting, so actually, is it different? Oh, yeah, so the failure up here is all in red. The failure down here actually has code highlighting. Oh, actually, that's pretty nice. Okay. So apparently RSpec automatically uses code ray if it's available, which is nice. Drive runs great with documentation. Let's do that real quick. Drive up. Well, it's not Kansas City. Okay. Yep, I'd agree with drive run being useful just to kind of see what your entire nesting of that stuff is. If we turn that back, then we're back to having the failure on the price. Thanks for the mention there. Okay. Identifying slow examples. Okay. This thing loves to fight me a little bit. So examples.rb. Yeah, it has weird formatting there. Okay, fine. Okay, so we have that. 0.1, 0.2. This will make sense in about 4 or 5 seconds. Mostly because I'm lazy. Okay, so this one is Control-Shift. And there we go. We have a bunch of examples. Pretty right for us right there. Okay. So we have slow examples, and then we also have the profile. So if we run that, it's going to take a little bit longer, and we'll see that the slowest examples we have there are taking 0.01. I wonder what's still running that. Whatever. Anyway, profile is good for a brief overview of how slow things are. Now, that said, I don't want this to accidentally sleep everything, so you get to be all exits for now, just in case I accidentally run that again. Okay. So running just what we need. Okay, running examples by name. Okay, so E is going to look for examples probably containing that text. So -- example or -E works there. Running specific failures. Again, notice that we have this lovely little thing right here at the bottom. I tend to love running those just because it allows me to focus in on that one spec that's doing it. I am currently reading through effective testing in RSpec 3. Okay. And I have the book over in a side window here, and we're just going through everything. And then we also have only failures. Right, they have a bunch of weird spaces in here. I wish it let me paste without formatting, but no such luck. Yeah, let's not do that. Yep, and notice that we have this over here, so just make sure I spell. Okay, take out the extra config. We have that. So we have that. And then if we happen to take this off, we'll still see the failure. And then if we run it again, it should only run that one spec. Okay, there we go. How long have I worked in Ruby? Professionally, I want to say about 12 years. Non-professionally, sometime whenever I was 14 or 15, I was into this thing called RPG Maker, which was a while ago. I wouldn't say that my code was particularly good back then, but it was Ruby code technically. Okay. So let's go ahead and fix that failing spec real quick. got that. So now we have that failure done, and that should have 0 things in there. You know, if I thought about it, I would have... okay. Interesting. I haven't actually looked at that. How's Gusto? I might loop back to that a little bit later as far as long explanation, but you're mentioning Alex. Alex is actually on my team, which is product modularization over there right now, and I was in the audience for that talk. I was also a speaker at that conference, but very, very different talk. But yeah, feel free to reach out and ask anything about Gusto over in the Discord community after, and I can give you a bit more of a detailed explanation. Okay. So now we have focused examples. Let's see here. So you could tag that with F on there. I'm going to say focus true instead. And I'm using Alt arrow to skip all those things. Eventually I'll learn how to do Twitch chat things for all the nice little things there, but for now, if you're looking for a Discord community, rubylearning.dev has a link to it. Okay, so we got that. We got those. Let's just do exactly what the book is doing there. Okay, so we have those. Right, config run when matching, focus true. So we'll put that up here in the configuration. So we got that. That'll have those options in there. And now we have run options, including focus true. We can add some tags to those. We will leave that alone. Okay. So let's see what we got here. Marking work in progress. Okay, so we can start with descriptions. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to take off the focus up here. Got it? Okay, let's see what we got. So there are a few different things we have in there. So we'll go ahead and add those descriptions. So we have both of those. Let's go ahead and clear that. Okay. So one of the nice things is there are 2 ways to ignore spec. The first one is to, well, not have a body to it. The second one is to put an X in front of it, which will filter this out as well. So we'll put that in there. Okay. So that allows us to skip out the cost is $1. If we put it back, that spec is back. Okay. Then we could also put some pending inside of there. So let's take both of these. We'll put that in there. Expect coffee color to be light. Color is not implemented yet. So this is an interesting one. You might wonder, how in the world is this working? To, be, and then less than right here. Well, that's because less than is technically a method, so what's actually happening here is this. So we got that, we can put that there, but Ruby nicety that we can play with a little bit. Okay, so if we run those, clear that. It'll say we have a failure, yes, but it's still marked as pending down here at the very bottom because we haven't implemented that and we put the pending tag in there. And are those supposed to be both under context milk? Okay, so we'll move those real quick. Okay. We have that, and then we want to say yep, and thank you again for the mention of the dry run flag, because it really does help to kind of see the structure of when the world is even being tested. And sometimes I don't want to go through all the specs to see that, because then I had to scroll down all the code and everything else in there. That just allows me to see at a glance, okay, what exactly are we testing here, which is far nicer sometimes. Okay, so we got that. Ingredients include milk. A, B, so color would be light, dark, and then they have that as 190. O, and then they had that as 205.0. Okay, so if we run both of those with pending still enabled, expected to fail, no error was raised. Okay. So we'll take both of these, yoink, and there we go. That works. And we got both of those. Use pending flags to test third-party code. Yeah, most of the time with third-party, that's where you end up running with a lot of your weird things. So let's take a look here. Have some examples, and going into chapter 3, which is the RSpec way, which is going over certain habits of RSpec, how you describe those otherwise. They start out by saying RSpec is designed to make certain habits easy, like writing examples that clearly spell out what you're doing, separating common setup from actual logic, and focusing on what you need just to make the next spec pass. But it says there's some costs, which are it takes time, running a large suite takes a lot of time potentially, and reading heavily factored tests requires hopping between setup and test code. So let's say you have a ton of lets, a ton of befores, and a huge amount of shared examples and everything else like that. How many files exactly are you hopping around trying to figure out what you're doing? That's one reason why dry run is very handy, just to get a quick example of things. But if your code is so dry, which is don't repeat yourself, that you had to jump around everywhere to understand what the world's going on, well, that's kind of pesky, isn't it? Well, one joke I used to say is that code which is too dry, don't repeat yourself, becomes brittle, which is badly refactored into tiny things lacking expressiveness. So be careful how much you extract things, because eventually you lose any sense of which direction is up anymore, and it becomes far more cumbersome to deal with. So what it goes through here, and we'll just breeze through a few of these real quick, are what are specs doing for you? Well, creating confidence, which are happy paths, and detecting errors, and the last feature you're making didn't break anything, and measurable progress towards a project. For me, confidence is only instilled whenever you also have all the failure cases you've tested, the edges and everything else like that. There's a bad habit sometime, which is you have one test doing one thing, which is only the happy path, but you have no test testing a negation of that, which are what happens if you do the opposite thing. Well, that ends up being a little bit more complicated. So if you don't handle all the cases of your spec, well, that's going to be kind of pesky. Like, for instance, you'll notice this color method. We only have tests for milk over here. We don't have tests for the above case, which would be the opposite thing outside of that context. So if we happen to do this, and we had these same specs there, we notice that these are going to fail. Because, for instance, this one happens to be 205. So now that we've changed the context, and if you're looking for context or branches you need to test, conditionals are a great example of that. So if we switch those both over, we can see that. And this is a good example of context, which is this is the normal context, and this is a special context only if you happen to add milk. So those things to me are very useful. And again, it mentions eliminating fear, which is innocuous changes break something in distant part of code. You don't know that until you've tested as much as you can as far as the failure cases, the context in which it could be called, and trying to really get some deep coverage over that. So do be careful on those. The other thing is refactoring, which if you're moving code around everywhere, it'd be nice to know what's actually breaking and what specs manage to go along with it. There are also things such as design and sustainability, documenting behavior, workflow, and some other things. So I'm not going to get too much into the rest of this because we're running a little bit over on time. But if you do want to discuss any more of this, feel free to hop over to the Discord channel we have over here. You can find that on rubylearning.dev, and there's going to be a link at the top of the page as well as around the pages. You can also find links to this Twitch channel as well as to the YouTube playlist where you'll find old courses as well as this course. We'll be making this one a little bit later and getting the playlist up, and I'll be fixing that link. But for now, that should about do it. Do I err on the side of too many tests? Yes. I'd rather test too much than test too little, because if I leave a bunch of blind spots of behaviors of things I did not anticipate, chances are that's going to be what breaks, and that's what someone's going to do, and that's what someone's going to use that behaves in an unexpected way. And that means that I have, in some ways, undermined the effectiveness of our entire test suite. Every time that there's something which isn't covered, and that provides a failure, well, then you get a little bit more wary of trusting your test suite. So you do have to be careful with some of that, of making sure you're trying to cover all the behaviors of your code. Which is why whenever someone says, why would you spend more than 50% of your time writing your tests? Well, writing the code's the easy part. Writing the test to try and catch all the ways that your code could behave, that's much harder. Well, I wouldn't say harder necessarily, as long as you're writing code in a way which can be testable. If you're writing your code in a different way, though, you're going to find out how many stubs and other things you have in there, which we'll be getting into a later chapter. But typically 60 to 70%, if not a little bit more, is what I spend on writing tests, because I want to make sure to get that right, both for future me and for anyone else who happens to touch this code, to give them confidence that, yes, they can make changes around here without thinking they're going to trip into some dark and hidden corner. So that's kind of how I look at that. So we have time for a few more questions. I'm going to hop over here. So I'm going to just mention on the Discord that we're running a few minutes late. So do we have any other questions or anything people would like to look into here? Okay. Well, with that all said, feel free to jump over to the education section and effective testing with RSpec 3. And I'd be happy to answer any other questions you have. Next week, we'll probably be looking at chapter 4. I'm going to decide if chapter 5 makes sense as well, and I'll be posting that in the channel as well as some updated guidance on that. In the meantime, have a great day, and thank you so much for coming out. I'll catch you all later.